The night Vivian Carter's world collapsed didn't announce itself with thunder. It came in the form of 3 black SUVs rolling through the iron gates of a dying estate. And the man who stepped out of the middle vehicle didn't need to raise his voice to make every person in that room stop breathing. Adrienne DeLuca had come to collect. Her father had borrowed money from the most dangerous man in the country. Now her father was dead. The debt had doubled with interest and silence, and Adrienne was standing in their foyer with a contract that wasn't a loan agreement. It was a marriage certificate with her name already printed on it. Vivian had 20 minutes to decide. Sign or lose everything. She picked up the pen. If this story already has your pulse running, drop a like and comment the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because what happens next changes everything you think you know about debt, power, and who's really been pulling the strings all along. The lawyer's office had told Vivian her father died clean. No outstanding balances, no liens on the property. The estate would transfer to her and her younger sister Chloe without complication, and all she needed to do was sign the probate forms and wait for the title to clear. She had believed them. That had been her first mistake. The second mistake was assuming that because Elliot Carter's name was never in the newspapers next to words like organized crime or federal investigation, that meant he had lived an ordinary life, that he had borrowed ordinary money from ordinary people, that the worst thing waiting on the other side of his death was an outstanding mortgage and a wine cellar that hadn't been restocked since 2019. Vivian found out the truth 43 days after they buried him, on a Tuesday in late October, when the letter arrived without a return address. It wasn't sealed with wax. It wasn't theatrical. It was a single sheet of cream-colored paper with 4 lines typed in 12-point font. Outstanding balance, $4.2 million. Grace period expires Friday 9 p.m. Location, the Carter estate. Come prepared to settle. No signature. No letterhead. Just those 4 lines and a bottom margin that had been left deliberately, conspicuously blank, as though whoever sent it knew the name attached to the debt didn't need to be written down to be recognized. Vivian stood in the kitchen of the estate for a long time after reading it. The house around her was enormous and half empty, the kind of place that had been grand once and now just echoed. The crown molding had hairline cracks. The chandelier in the front hall had 3 dead bulbs. Nobody had gotten around to replacing. She could hear Chloe upstairs moving around in her bedroom, the familiar shuffle of socked feet on hardwood. And that sound, that small, domestic, ordinary sound, was the thing that finally made Vivian fold the letter and put it in her jacket pocket. $4.2 million. She was a 26-year-old woman who worked as a contract paralegal and drove a car with a cracked passenger side mirror. Chloe was 20, a sophomore in college, and had no idea their father had left behind anything more complicated than a house that needed gutters replaced and a reputation for being difficult at dinner parties. Vivian didn't tell her about the letter. She spent the next 3 days making calls she didn't know how to make. She called the estate lawyer, who went very quiet on the phone and then said in a careful voice that he wasn't aware of any financial obligations of that nature. She called her father's accountant, who said the same thing but sweated harder. She could hear it in the pauses between his sentences. She pulled every document she could find in her father's home office, which was a room she had avoided for weeks because it still smelled like his cologne, and she wasn't ready for that yet. What she found didn't tell her where $4 million had gone, but it told her that money had moved, large amounts of it, regularly, in directions that didn't match any legitimate investment she could identify. Shell companies, wire transfers to accounts and names she didn't recognize, numbers that didn't reconcile against anything. She was still sitting on the office floor surrounded by bank statements at 8:45 on Friday night when she heard the cars pull up. Not one car. 3. The sound of gravel under multiple sets of tires, the specific crunch and weight of vehicles that were large and unhurried and entirely unconcerned about announcing their arrival. Vivian got up off the floor. She walked to the window and looked out through the gap in the curtains, and what she saw made the air go out of her lungs in one slow, quiet exhale. 3 black SUVs had come through the front gate, not the kind of SUVs that businessmen rented from airports. the kind with reinforced panels and no exterior badges, and men standing beside them who wore their stillness like a uniform. They were positioned in a loose arc in front of the main entrance, and the one in the center had its rear door open, and the man stepping out of it was someone Vivian recognized without having ever met him in person. She had seen Adrian DeLuca's face twice. Once in a photograph in a magazine that had profiled the city's legitimate business elite. He had a stake in 3 real estate development firms and a hospitality group, and the writer had described him as reclusive but formidable. The second time was in a news segment about a federal investigation into organized crime that had ultimately resulted in no charges filed and a lot of unnamed sources saying very carefully worded nothing. In both images, he had looked the same: dark suit, controlled expression, the specific quality of stillness that belonged to men who had long since stopped needing to prove anything. In person, standing in the pale floodlight of the estate's exterior lamps, he was taller than she'd expected. And he wasn't moving toward the door yet. He was standing at the base of the steps with his hands in his pockets, looking at the facade of the house with the patience of someone who had waited for things before and was entirely comfortable waiting again. Vivian's heart was doing something loud and complicated in her chest. She pressed her palm flat against the wall beside the window to steady herself and breathed out once, deliberately, and then walked to the front hall. Their housekeeper, Marta, was already there, standing near the door with her hands clasped and her face carefully neutral in the way it got when she was frightened but didn't want to show it. 2 of the estate's groundskeeping staff, men who doubled as security because her father had apparently felt that was necessary, though Vivian had never understood why, were positioned on either side of the hall, and they were very still in a way that confirmed they knew exactly who was outside. "Don't open it yet," Vivian said. "Miss Carter." "Give me a second." She looked at herself in the mirror beside the coat rack. She was still wearing the clothes she'd had on all day: dark trousers, a gray sweater with a small stain near the hem from where she'd spilled coffee at 7 in the morning. Her hair had partially come loose from where she'd pinned it. She looked like someone who had been sitting on a floor reading bank statements, because that was exactly what she was. She fixed her hair. She blotted the stain with her thumb, which didn't help. She straightened her spine until it felt like it might crack, and then she nodded at Marta. Marta opened the door. Adrian DeLuca climbed the last 2 steps unhurriedly and walked into her house like he'd been inside it before, though Vivian was almost certain he hadn't. He had 3 men with him. Not the full complement from outside, just 3, which she understood was a kind of deliberate signal. Enough to make a point. Not enough to suggest he was expecting resistance he'd need help managing. He stopped in the center of the foyer and looked at Vivian the way you look at something you've been given a description of and are now checking against the reality. "Miss Carter," he said. His voice was low and unhurried. It didn't match anything she'd braced for. She'd expected coldness or the theatrical menace of someone who wanted her frightened. What she got instead was the voice of a man making a routine appointment. "Mr. DeLuca," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she deserved credit for. "You received my letter." "I received a letter," she said. "I'm still not entirely clear on whether that letter represents a legitimate debt or a number someone invented and attached to my dead father's name because they assumed I wouldn't be in a position to push back." Something shifted in his expression. It wasn't quite amusement. It was more like recalibration, like she'd said something that adjusted a variable he'd already accounted for, but he'd miscalculated the value. "The debt is legitimate," he said. "I'd like documentation." "You'll have it." He looked around the foyer once, briefly, and then back at her. "Is there somewhere we can sit?" She wanted to say no. She wanted to tell him to conduct his business in the foyer, or not at all, that she wasn't in the habit of making men who arrived unannounced comfortable in her home. But she was also, underneath the sheer white noise of her own fear, a practical woman. And practical women understood that there was a time for posturing and a time for information gathering, and right now she needed information a great deal more than she needed to make a point. "The study," she said. She led him down the hall. His men stayed near the entrance. Vivian was aware of them the way you're aware of something at the edge of your peripheral vision, a constant, low-level pressure that didn't go away. The study was her father's room in the truest sense, which meant it was the room she'd been avoiding. Leather chairs, dark wood. The desk where she'd found the bank statements still visible through the half-open door to the adjacent office. She turned on the lamp on the side table and sat in the chair across from the one she indicated for him, and he sat, and for a moment neither of them said anything. He reached into his jacket and placed a folder on the coffee table between them. She opened it. The documentation was meticulous. Dates, amounts, wire transfer confirmations, signed acknowledgement letters with her father's signature, which she recognized because she'd spent 3 days staring at his handwriting on the documents she'd pulled from this same room. The debt was real. $4.2 million, accrued over a period of 18 months beginning 3 years before her father's death. The interest rate was brutal, but documented. The terms were documented. The initial agreement was documented, and her father's signature was on every page. Vivian closed the folder. "What are the terms for settlement?" she said, not a question. "Full payment within 30 days, or liquidation of estate assets to cover the balance." The estate assets wouldn't cover it. "No," he agreed. "They wouldn't." She set the folder on the table and looked at him directly. "Then what are we actually talking about? Because you didn't drive out here with 3 cars and hand me paperwork you could have sent through a lawyer if the answer was just liquidation of assets. So what are we actually talking about, Mr. DeLuca?" He looked at her for a moment. Then he reached back into his jacket and placed a second document on the table. It was a single page. Clean. Minimal. At the top in plain type. Marriage agreement. Term contract. She stared at it. 12 months, he said. A marriage in legal terms. You live as my wife for 1 calendar year. At the end of that year, the debt is formally discharged. Your family's name is cleared of every financial obligation connected to Elliot Carter, and the estate remains in your possession and Chloe's, unencumbered. The room was very quiet. "You're not serious," Vivian said. "I don't make offers I'm not serious about. You want to marry me to cancel a debt? I want you to enter into a legal marriage with me for a period of 12 months, yes." She pushed the document back across the table. "That's not an offer. That's something else entirely, and I'm not going to pretend I don't know it." He didn't touch the document. "I understand how it sounds." "Do you? Because it sounds like you've arrived at my house after my father died and told me the price of keeping my family from losing everything is for me to sign myself over to you for a year. Do you understand how that sounds?" "Yes," and his voice didn't change. There was no defensiveness in it, no shift toward apology. He said yes, like a man acknowledging a fact. "I understand exactly how it sounds. And I'm telling you that this is the offer." "Why?" The word came out raw. She hadn't planned for it to. "You run 3 legitimate development firms and whatever else you run that doesn't make the business pages. You don't need a wife. You certainly don't need me. So why?" He was quiet for 3 seconds. It felt longer. "There are things happening inside my organization and outside of it that I'm not in a position to explain to you tonight. What I can tell you is that your presence, as my legal wife, serves a purpose that goes beyond anything personal. And in exchange for that, I am offering you a clean exit from a situation that would otherwise take everything you have left." "That's not an answer. It's the answer I'm giving you right now." She stood up. She walked to the window of the study and stood there with her back to him and her arms crossed over her chest, looking at the dark lawn and the shadows of the men waiting near the cars. Her jaw was so tight it ached. Her hands were cold. Chloe. Upstairs. Socked feet on hardwood, 20 years old and completely unaware that the life they'd been holding together with both hands since the funeral was one conversation away from being dismantled entirely. "If I refuse," Vivian said, still facing the window, "the estate goes into asset review on Monday. The process takes 4 to 6 weeks. At the end of it, the balance will be collected in whatever form the available assets allow. Your sister will need to arrange alternative housing before the end of the calendar year. And if I agree, you and Chloe keep the estate. The debt is discharged in full. Chloe's education costs are covered for the remainder of her degree. And in 12 months, you walk away clean." Vivian turned around. He was watching her without urgency, without the performed patience of someone waiting for her to stop making things difficult. He was just watching, The way you watch something you've already determined the outcome of, but are allowing the space to arrive at on its own. It made her angrier than anything else he could have done. I want 3 things in writing, she said. Name them. Chloe is not told the actual terms of this arrangement. As far as she knows, we met through legitimate channels and this is a real marriage. She doesn't carry the weight of this. He nodded once. I want a separate clause that if at any point during the 12 months I determine my physical safety or my sister's physical safety is at risk, I can exit the agreement without penalty. A pause. Agreed, with the provision that the determination of risk is jointly assessed. No, my assessment is final. Another pause, longer this time. Agreed. Third, she walked back to the table and picked up the contract. I want a copy of every document related to my father's original debt, every record, every transfer, every communication. If I'm entering into this, I want to know what I'm actually walking into. Something crossed his face then, something that wasn't quite surprise but was close to it. He looked at her with a particular attention, like a calculation had just come back with an unexpected result. That, he said slowly, may be more complicated than the other 2. Then we don't have a deal. The silence stretched. One of the men near the entrance shifted his weight. Outside, a branch moved against the study window. All right, Adrian said. She set the contract back on the table. She looked at it for a moment, at her name printed neatly in the signature line, at the 12 clean months represented in the clause below it. Then she picked up the pen from the desk. Her hand was steady. She didn't know how. Everything inside her was a kind of organized wreckage, the pieces of the last 3 days of her life rearranged into a shape she didn't have a name for yet. But her hand was steady, and she put the pen to the line and signed her name in full. Vivian Renee Carter. Adrian signed below her, and then folded the contract and placed it back in his jacket without ceremony, without triumph, without anything that could be read as satisfaction. Someone will be here tomorrow at 9 with the documentation you requested, he said. Fine. And on Saturday, he paused, choosing the phrasing. I'd like to arrange for you to meet with my house staff. There will be practical logistics that need to be addressed. Of course there will, she said, and her voice came out flat in a way she hadn't intended. He looked at her for a moment, just a moment, and said, This is survivable, Miss Carter. Don't, she said. He didn't say anything else. He turned and walked back toward the entrance. His men moved when he moved, the quiet synchronization of people who did this professionally. Vivian stayed in the study until she heard the front door close, until she heard the cars start and the sound of tires on gravel pulling away through the gate. Then she sat down in the leather chair and put her face in her hands and stayed there until the shaking in her chest settled back into something she could breathe around. Marta appeared in the doorway with a glass of water and didn't say anything, which was exactly the right thing. Vivian took the glass, drank half of it, set it down on the coffee table next to the folder of her father's debt documentation. Then she stood up, walked upstairs, and knocked on Chloe's door. Hey, Chloe said, pulling the door open. She had headphones around her neck and a textbook open on her bed, and the easy, uncomplicated face of someone who believed the night was ordinary. What's up? Vivian looked at her sister for a long moment. I need to tell you something, she said. I met someone. She hated herself a little, saying it, but she smiled because that was what you did. And Chloe's face shifted into curiosity and then something warmer, and for now, that was enough. For now, the lie was a kindness, and kindnesses were the only currency Vivian had left. The documentation arrived at 9:15 the following morning, delivered by a man in a dark coat who handed Vivian a sealed envelope and was back in his car before she'd finished checking the contents at the door. She spread everything across the kitchen table and spent 4 hours going through it. What she found did not match the story she'd been told. The loan had been initiated with her father's signature, yes, but the records leading up to that signature, emails, meeting notes, communication logs that someone had either forgotten to remove or deliberately included in what Adrian's people had sent her, told a different story. Elliot Carter had been approached, not by Adrian DeLuca, but by a man named Rowan Steele, who had presented himself as a financial intermediary representing a private investment consortium. The money had been structured as a co-investment opportunity in a commercial real estate deal that was, based on the documents in front of her, entirely fabricated. Her father had been maneuvered into signing agreements that he hadn't fully understood, routed through 3 layers of shell entities, and by the time the actual nature of the transaction became clear, the money had already transferred and the debt had already been assigned. Assigned to Adrian DeLuca's organization. Her father hadn't borrowed money from Adrian DeLuca. Someone had used Adrian DeLuca's money, or money connected to his organization, to run a fraud, and her father had been the instrument of it. Vivian sat very still at the kitchen table. She picked up the documents again and read the name a second time. Rowan Steele. She didn't know who that was, but somewhere in the back of the envelope, clipped to the last page of the communication log, there was a photograph. Printed in color, slightly grainy, the kind taken from a distance by someone who didn't want to be noticed. 2 men at a restaurant table. One of them was her father. The other one, she didn't recognize. Mid-50s, silver-haired, the confident posture of someone accustomed to rooms where decisions were made. On the back of the photograph, in handwriting she didn't recognize, someone had written 4 words. He's still out there. Vivian set the photograph down on the table. She looked at it for a long time. Then she picked up her phone and called the number that had been included with the documentation. It rang twice. "Miss Carter," Adrian said. "We need to talk," she said. "Not about the marriage. About what's actually in these files. Because I don't think my father was the only person this happened to, and I don't think whoever ran this scheme is finished." A silence on the other end of the line. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted. Not softer, but more specific, the way a man's voice gets when he's talking about something that actually costs him something. "No," he said. "He's not finished." "Then tell me who Rowan Steele is." Another silence. Longer. "I'll be there at 6, he said. The line went dead. Vivian put the phone down on top of the photograph and looked out the kitchen window at the overgrown garden her father had never gotten around to fixing, and felt the first real threat of something that wasn't fear or grief or anger, but was, underneath all of those things, very close to purpose. Whatever her father had gotten himself into, he hadn't done it alone. And whoever had put him there was still moving. Adrian had her by the arm before the echo finished, and they were already moving, through the library door, into the corridor, the alarm screaming through every wall of the house, in a pitch that made the back of Vivian's teeth ache. She kept her grip on the oilcloth sleeve. She didn't think about it. Her hand simply closed around it and didn't let go, the way a body makes decisions before the mind catches up. He pulled her left, away from the main staircase, toward a narrower door at the end of the corridor that she had assumed was a linen closet. It wasn't. Behind it was a stairwell, plain concrete, industrial lighting, the kind of infrastructure that existed in a house like this for exactly this kind of moment. He hit the light switch with the flat of his palm, and they went down fast. His hand still on her arm, not gripping but present, a point of contact that was purely functional and communicated everything it needed to without a single word. 2 floors down. A door. A keypad. He punched in a code without looking at the numbers, and the door opened onto a space beneath the house. Low ceiling, concrete floor, a generator in the corner that was already humming, fluorescent lighting that buzzed to life with the slow reluctance of something that didn't get used often. 2 of his men were already there, not Carver. She noticed that immediately. Adrian let go of her arm and turned to the taller of the 2 men, mid-30s, close-cropped hair, a scar along his left jawline that had healed badly. "Carver," Adrian said. "In the wind," the man said. East wing door was open, 15-minute window, maybe less. And the device. Small, east exterior wall, designed to trigger the security system, not cause structural damage. A beat, designed to move us. Vivian understood that immediately, and could see from the set of Adrian's shoulders that he understood it too. Not an attack, a displacement. Something designed to flush people out of position, create chaos, create movement, so that someone watching from outside could track where they went and what they carried. She looked down at the oilcloth sleeve in her hands. "They wanted to see if I'd run with it," she said. Both men looked at her. "If there was something worth having, I'd carry it when I ran. That's how you confirm someone found what you were looking for." She looked at Adrian. which means there's a camera position on the exits. He turned to the man with the scar. Reyes. Already on it. Reyes moved to a mounted screen on the far wall. Security feeds, a grid of 8, cycling through exterior positions. He pulled up the northeast corner, the south service entrance, the front gate. There. He touched the screen. Sedan. Different plates than this morning, parked facing the service gate. They can't see inside this room, Adrian said. It wasn't a question. No external camera line to the basement access. Adrian turned back to Vivian. His face was doing the things she'd started to recognize, the specific stillness that meant he was running calculations behind his eyes and hadn't finished yet. His shirt had come partly untucked on the right side. There was a small cut on the back of his hand that she hadn't noticed before, already dried. We're not going anywhere tonight, he said. I know. The plan to move the envelope changes, she said. Yes, I know that too. She looked at the oilcloth sleeve. Can we open it here? He looked at Reyes. Reyes nodded once. Then let's find out what my father died for, she said, and her voice came out steady, which cost her something she'd deal with later. She set the sleeve on the work table along the far wall and peeled back the oilcloth. Inside was the manila envelope, sealed with 3 strips of tape across the flap, her father's handwriting across the back in black marker. V, if not me, then you. Just that. No explanation, no instruction. 4 words and her initial, written in the hand of a man who had apparently known, at some point, that he might not be the one to use what was inside. Vivian stood there with that for exactly 3 seconds. Then she broke the tape and opened the envelope. Inside was a second, smaller envelope, sealed. A USB drive taped to its exterior. A folded sheet of paper covered front and back in her father's handwriting. Dense, compressed, the marginalia style of a man trying to get everything onto one page. And beneath all of that, a series of photographs printed on standard paper, slightly faded, the kind you'd print from a home inkjet when you didn't want a record of having used a print shop. She unfolded the handwritten page first. It took her 8 minutes to read it. The room was quiet except for the generator hum and Reyes moving occasionally at the security monitors. Adrian stood at her shoulder, not crowding, but close enough that she knew he was reading it too, and she let that happen because there wasn't time for privacy to be more important than information. When she finished, she set the page down flat on the table and pressed both palms against the surface and breathed. He knew, she said. He knew. He knew from the beginning that the investment was fraudulent. He figured it out. 2 months in, he had enough to know the whole structure was manufactured. She kept her voice controlled. He didn't go to investigators because Steele made it clear what would happen if he did. He kept records instead, documented everything, held it, and... She stopped. And tried to find a way to use it that didn't get him killed, Adrian said quietly. He was building towards something. He was looking for... There's a name here. Marcus Vile. He mentions him 3 times. She picked up the page. He says Vale is the connection between Steele's financial network and the federal investigation. That Vale was feeding case direction to someone inside the grand jury process. Adrian was very still. You know that name, she said. Marcus Vale is a federal prosecutor, he said. He's been connected peripherally to the grand jury investigation, not the lead. The lead is a woman named Dana Cho, who I believe is legitimate. But Vale has been advising the process, providing historical case context. He's steering it. If your father's account is accurate, yes. Vivian picked up the photographs, went through them one by one. Her father and Steele, multiple meetings. Her father and a third man she didn't recognize, heavy-set, late 40s, expensive watch. Her father alone outside a building she recognized after a moment as a federal office building 2 districts over. Then the last photograph. She stopped. It was different from the others. Sharper. Taken more recently based on the quality of the image. Her father wasn't in it. It was 2 men she'd never seen together. Rowan Steele, the silver-haired man from the earlier photograph, and someone else. Someone whose face she had seen in the last 8 days inside this house. Not Carver. Not anyone in this room. She held the photograph up and turned it toward Adrian. He looked at it, and for the first time since she'd met him, the stillness broke. It was subtle, just a tightening around the jaw, a single sharp exhale through the nose, the way a body responds to impact before the mind processes the signal. But she was watching for it, the way she'd been watching everything in this house for 8 days, and she saw it. "Who is he?" she said. Adrian didn't answer immediately. "Adrian." She put his name out there plain, no softening. "Who is he?" "His name is Daniel Forsyth," he said. "He's been my legal counsel for 11 years. The generator hummed. Reyes hadn't moved at the security monitors, but his shoulders had changed. A slight adjustment, the kind that meant he was listening very carefully while pretending to look at screens. "Your lawyer," Vivian said. "Yes." "Has been meeting with Rowan Steele." "Apparently." "And your legal counsel would have—" She stopped, made herself slow down. "He would have visibility on the grand jury documents. He would know exactly what investigators had, what direction the case was moving, what evidence had been submitted." "Yes." "He would also know," she said, "that you were acquiring the Carter debt. He would know the timeline of the marriage contract. He would know I went back to the estate today because you would have—" She looked at him. "Did you tell him?" Silence. "Adrian, did you tell Forsyth you sent me to retrieve personal belongings today?" "I mentioned it this morning," he said. Each word came out separate and deliberate, the sound of a man accepting a specific weight. "In a call about the legal structure of the estate transfer." "He told them," she said. "He told them I was going back to the house. They were watching because he told them." She set the photograph down. Her hands were very steady, which she found almost funny in a way that wasn't funny at all. "Your lawyer has been their inside line this entire time, not Carver. Carver was a distraction, or a second layer. Forsyth is the source." Adrian turned away from the table, walked 3 steps toward the far wall and stopped there with his back to the room. His shoulders were tight. She could see the tension in them from across the space, the particular physical cost of having trusted someone for 11 years and finding out in a basement what that trust was worth. She let him have the 3 seconds. Then, "I need you to think clearly right now." He turned back. Whatever had crossed his face in those 3 seconds was gone, locked back into the controlled surface that was just how he operated, and she respected that even as it made her feel the distance between them like a physical wall. "Forsyth has already reported that you went to the estate," he said. "He may or may not know you found something. What he knows for certain is that you came back here, and that the security alarm triggered, which could mean we have the envelope, or could mean we ran when things got loud and brought nothing." He looked at the table, at the envelope, the photographs, the USB drive, the handwritten page. "How much is on the drive?" "I don't know yet. We need to know." Reyes moved away from the monitors and produced a laptop from a locked cabinet along the wall, the kind of specific preparedness that told Vivian this room had been used before in situations that required exactly this. He set it on the work table and opened it. She inserted the USB drive. The drive contained 63 files, audio recordings, PDFs of bank records, 3 video files, and a folder labeled simply Veil that contained 14 documents she recognized immediately as internal grand jury correspondence, the kind of material that should have been under federal seal. "My father," she said quietly, "had a source inside the investigation. Or Veil's operation was leakier than they knew. Or both." She opened the first audio file. A few seconds of ambient sound, the background noise of a restaurant, and then 2 voices. One of them was Rowan Steele. She recognized it from the single voicemail he had apparently left her father, transcribed in the handwritten notes. The other voice was measured, slightly nasal, the voice of a man who is accustomed to being the most careful person in any room. The Carter situation needs to close before the end of the quarter. The longer the asset hangs open, the more visibility it creates. He's cooperative. He's cornered. There's a difference. Cornered men are cooperative until they're not, and when they're not, they become problems. Then we ensure he doesn't become a problem. A pause, long enough to carry its own weight. "Understood." Vivian reached out and closed the audio file. The room was very quiet. "That's Vael," she said. "Yes," Adrian said. He had come back to stand beside the table, and his voice had the flat quality of something that had been through fire and come out the other side changed. "That is Marcus Vail. Discussing my father." "Yes." 14 days before he died. Adrian said nothing. She looked at the screen. At the folder named Vail and the 63 files arranged in a neat grid and the date stamp on the audio recording, which was March 9th, and the date of her father's cardiac event, which was March 23rd. "This is enough," she said. "This is enough to take to federal investigators, not the grand jury. Another avenue. Dana Cho, you said she's legitimate. She is. But accessing her directly outside the formal case structure, without going through Vial, that's a move that has to happen fast and has to happen right. The moment Forsyth suspects we have this, he already suspects." She turned to face him fully. "He told them I went to the estate. They sent someone to watch the exits. They triggered the alarm to flush us out. They're not wondering whether we found something, Adrian. They're operating on the assumption that we did, which means the window to move is hours," he said, "not days." "Yes." They looked at each other across the work table. In the fluorescent light of the basement, without the careful geography of the rooms upstairs, without the practiced distance of the last 8 days, he looked like what he actually was. A man who had built something large and was watching the people he'd let inside it take it apart from the foundation. And she looked like what she actually was. A woman who had signed a contract to save her sister and found herself standing in a basement holding the proof of her father's murder. "Who else in your organization can we trust?" she said. "Reyes," he said without hesitation. "2 others outside this house. Nobody else until we know the full shape of what Forsyth passed." "Is there a way to reach Dana Cho that doesn't go through any channel Forsyth has visibility on?" Adrian looked at Reyes. Reyes said, "There's a way. It's not clean." "Clean is finished," Vivian said. "What do we have?" Reyes looked at Adrian. Adrian nodded once. "There's a federal public integrity attorney," Reyes said. "Name's Garland. He's had intermittent contact with our organization over the years. Not cooperative, exactly, but not adversarial. He operates independently from the grand jury division. He has a standing working relationship with Cho." "He's a bridge," Vivian said, "if he agrees to be." "Can you reach him tonight?" "I can reach his office, whether he picks up at—" Reyes checked his watch. "At 10:47 on a Tuesday night is a different question." "Try," Vivian said. Reyes moved to the far end of the room, phone in hand, and Vivian looked back at the laptop screen. At 63 files her father had assembled over months, hiding them behind a fireplace grate in a sealed firebox, writing her initial on the outside in case he didn't make it to use them himself. V. If not me, then you. She had not allowed herself to feel it fully yet. There would be time for that. The grief that had already been there for 6 weeks was going to have to expand to accommodate a new shape, a harder one, and she would have to do that work eventually, and it was going to be devastating. But not tonight. Tonight the feeling was compressed into something functional, something that moved through her chest like fuel rather than weight. She would grieve later. Right now she had 63 files and a closing window, and a man standing beside her who had 11 fewer people he could trust than he'd had this morning. Adrian's phone vibrated. He looked at it. His face didn't change, but something around his eyes did. "What?" she said. He turned the phone so she could see the screen. It was a text from an unknown number. 4 words and a photograph. The words, "We have the sister." The photograph was Chloe, standing outside the university library, taken tonight. She was wearing the green jacket she'd bought last month, the one she'd called Vivian about from the store because she wanted a second opinion on the color. Vivian's whole body went cold. She took the phone from his hand and stared at the photograph, and then she looked at Adrian with an expression that she could feel was not a careful expression, that had nothing managed or controlled in it. That was the most honest thing she'd shown anyone in this entire ordeal, which was pure, undiluted terror wearing the thin mask of fury. "Get her back," she said, "right now. That is the only thing that matters to me. Everything else—" "I know," he said. And he was already moving, already reaching for Reyes, already doing the thing that people who operated in this world did. When the stakes shifted from abstract to personal, when the enemy stopped threatening empires and started threatening the specific, irreplaceable people who had nothing to do with any of it. But the phone vibrated again in Vivian's hand. Second message. Same unknown number. Bring the drive. Meridian Shipping Terminal. 2 hours. Come with DeLuca. Come alone or she doesn't come back. Vivian read it twice. Then she looked at Adrian and he looked at her, and they both understood at exactly the same moment that the envelope, the recordings, the 63 files, the entire architecture of everything her father had spent his final months building, all of it had just become secondary to a 20-year-old girl in a green jacket who had no idea why any of this was happening. And that Rowan Steele, or Marcus Vale, or whoever was holding the phone on the other end of those two messages, had just made the most significant miscalculation of this entire operation. Because they had assumed Vivian Carter would panic. She didn't panic. She copied all 63 files to the laptop's local drive, ejected the USB, pocketed it, looked at Adrian with a steadiness that she could feel coming from somewhere below fear, and said, "Tell me everything you know about Meridian Shipping Terminal." The terminal sat at the end of a commercial pier that had been officially decommissioned 18 months ago, which meant the city had stopped maintaining the access road but hadn't yet gotten around to removing the fencing. And the result was a half-mile of cracked asphalt bordered by chain link that rattled in the harbor wind like something trying to warn you off. Adrian drove. Vivian sat in the passenger seat with the USB drive in her jacket pocket and her hands loose in her lap. Deliberately loose, a conscious physical choice, because every instinct she had wanted to close them into fists, and she couldn't afford that kind of tension right now. Reyes was in a second vehicle, hanging back 3 blocks, which was the compromise they'd arrived at in the 7 minutes of hard, clipped argument that had taken place in the basement before they'd moved. The text said, "Come alone." The text said, "Come with DeLuca." Those two instructions contradicted each other in a way that told Vivian the person who sent them wasn't careful about language, which told her something about how they were operating, on pressure and improvisation, not on a plan that had been in place for weeks. That was a small advantage. She was holding it like a stone in a closed fist, feeling its edges. "The terminal," she said. "How many entry points?" 3 that I know of: main vehicle gate, service entrance on the south side, and a loading dock on the water side that's been sealed but can be accessed from the pier. Adrian's eyes were on the road. His voice was doing the flat operational thing that she'd come to understand was not coldness, but concentration. The way some people went quiet inside a crisis, while everything around them got louder. If they have people positioned, the vehicle gate will be covered. They'll expect us to come through there. Then we don't. The south entrance is on a blind side from the main floor. We can get inside without being seen from the central loading area. How do you know the layout? A brief pause. My organization used this terminal for storage 3 years ago, before it was decommissioned. She filed that without comment. Where would they hold someone? Central floor is open, 2 exposed. There's an office block on the north interior wall, 2 floors, glass partitions on the lower level. Good sight lines from inside. If I were holding someone, I'd use the upper level. Control the high ground. And they'd expect you to know that. Yes. So they'll have coverage on the upper level approach. Yes. Which means Chloe is either on the upper level with coverage, or they moved her somewhere less obvious to use as a second card. She looked out the passenger window at the dark water visible between the warehouses they were passing. They're not going to give her back. The words landed in the car without drama. Just the truth of it, stated plainly, because there wasn't room for anything else tonight. No, Adrian said. They're not. They want the drive, and they want to close the leak, which means they want both of us inside that building where they control the geometry. She turned back to face forward. So we don't give them the geometry. Vivian, I'm not walking in there to trade the drive for Chloe and hoping they honor the exchange. That's not a plan. That's a way to lose everything at once. Her voice was even. We go in through the south entrance. We locate Chloe before we make contact. We create a second option before we let them know we're inside. Adrian was quiet for a moment. The pier access road appeared ahead, the chain-link fence visible in the headlights, the gates standing open in the way that gates left open for you are never reassuring. Reyes can take the water side, he said. Yes, and I need you to trust that I can move without being managed. He glanced at her. Just once, brief, but she caught it. The specific quality of that look, which wasn't doubt exactly, but was its close neighbor. I've been inside 3 hostile environments in the last 8 days, she said. I grew up in that estate with a father who apparently had more enemies than I knew, and who taught me, without ever explaining why, how to move quietly through a space and how to read a room before I announced myself in it. She paused. I think I understand now why he taught me those things. The car stopped. Adrian killed the headlights. They sat in the dark for 5 seconds. The wind off the water moved through the fence and made the chain link sing. South entrance, he said. Stay 2 steps behind me until we're inside and I've read the floor. Agreed. If shooting starts, I'll deal with that when it happens. Vivian. I'll deal with it, she said again, and opened the door. The air outside was cold and salt-thick, the harbor smell of diesel and low tide and something industrial underneath it all. The asphalt under her feet was uneven, heaved by weather and neglect, and she picked her footing carefully in the dark, staying close to the fence line where the shadow was deepest. Adrian moved ahead of her, and she watched how he moved. Economy, no wasted motion, the body language of someone who had learned long ago that noise and visibility were the same problem. The south entrance was a personnel door, padlocked from the outside with a chain that had been cut. Recently, the cut end of the chain was bright metal, no oxidation. Someone had opened this entrance deliberately, recently enough that it still smelled of fresh metal shavings. Adrian pushed the door inward slowly. No squeal from the hinges. They'd been oiled, she noticed, which meant whoever had scouted this location had done the basic preparation work. That was more careful than the panicked text messages had suggested, and it revised her estimate upward of how much of tonight was improvised and how much had been quietly assembled in advance. Inside, the terminal floor was vast and dim, lit only by the ambient light coming through the high clerestory windows. The harbor's reflected glow, orange and gray, coming down in bars across rows of empty shelving units, and the skeletal frames of decommissioned loading equipment. The smell was rust and old moisture, and the ghost of whatever had been stored here. Their footsteps on the concrete were unavoidable, but the ambient noise of the building, the wind working at the roof panels, the harbor sounds pushing through, gave them cover if they stayed below a certain threshold. Adrian stopped her with one hand on her arm and pointed. North wall, upper level, a light source. Pale, artificial, the kind that came from a work lamp or a phone. Moving slightly. Someone up there was moving. She counted the seconds between movements. Irregular. Not a guard pacing. A person who was scared, shifting position the way frightened people do when they can't stay still. Chloe. She felt the certainty of it like a hand closing around her chest, and she made herself breathe through it without letting it change her pace. Adrian pointed left toward the stairwell access on the west wall, and they moved. The floor was cluttered with the decommissioning residue of an industrial space, coiled cable, wooden pallets, a collapsed shelving unit that she stepped over with careful precision. 12 meters to the stairwell, 10, 7. A sound. Above them and to the right, footsteps, deliberate ones, the kind that were meant to be heard. They both stopped. A voice came from the upper level, not loud, carrying the particular lack of urgency of someone who knew they held the advantage and was comfortable waiting for you to figure that out. You can stop moving around down there. A male voice, slightly hoarse, the voice of a man who smoked, or had shouted a lot in his life. I've had eyes on you since the south door. Come up the west stairs. Hands visible. Vivian looked at Adrian in the near dark. He looked back. His jaw was tight. She could see the exact moment he made the calculation, the cost of compliance against the cost of whatever the alternative was. And then he nodded once, and they moved to the stairwell and went up. The upper level was a catwalk and office block, just as Adrian had described, with glass partitions along the interior wall and the open terminal floor visible below through a safety railing on the other side. The work lamp she'd seen from below was positioned on a folding table inside the nearest office partition, casting a harsh white circle in the surrounding gray. 3 men. One she didn't recognize, heavy-set, near the railing with his arms crossed. One near the partition door with a posture that communicated his function without needing a label. And the third, standing at the center of the lit space, facing them as they came off the top of the stairs. Rowan Steele. Silver-haired, impeccably composed, wearing the confident stillness of a man who had been in difficult rooms before and had left them on his terms. And behind him, inside the glass partition, sitting in a chair with her wrists zip-tied to its frame and her eyes too wide and her green jacket torn at the shoulder, Chloe. Chloe saw Vivian and her face did something that Vivian absorbed and immediately locked away because she could not deal with it right now. Later. She would deal with what her sister's face looked like in this moment later, when she had the luxury of falling apart. "Miss Carter," Steele said. He looked at Adrian, and as requested. He didn't offer a hand. Nobody in this kind of room offered hands. "You made good time." "The drive," Vivian said. "Straight to it. No preamble." "In a moment." He tilted his head slightly, the gesture of a man who found her directness mildly interesting. "I want to have a conversation first." "You have my sister zip-tied to a chair. There's nothing you want to say that I want to hear." "That may be true, but you'll hear it anyway." He looked at Adrian. "You've had an eventful evening. I understand Daniel gave you some trouble." "We're done discussing Forsyth," Adrian said. "Forsyth is actually why we're here." Steele moved to the folding table and rested one hand on it, unhurried. "Daniel has been extraordinarily helpful to us over the past 18 months. But I want to be clear about something, because I think you're operating under a misapprehension." He looked at Vivian. "Your father's records, the ones you retrieved tonight, they're incomplete." Vivian said nothing. She was watching his hands, his weight distribution, the man near the railing, the man near the partition door. She was watching Chloe breathe. "The recordings on that drive," Steele continued, "document approximately 40% of the transaction architecture. The remaining documentation, the material that would establish the full scope, including the federal connections, is held separately. Has been held separately since your father put it there, as insurance he was never in a position to deploy." He paused. "Because he made an error, Miss Carter. Your father went to someone for help, someone he believed was outside our network, someone he trusted." The cold that had been in her chest since the photograph in the basement sharpened into something specific. "Who?" she said. Steele reached into his jacket and placed a photograph on the folding table and slid it toward her. She crossed the space and picked it up and looked at it, and the floor did not move beneath her feet, but it felt like it did, for 3 full seconds, like the entire physical world had performed a small and sickening tilt. The photograph showed her father. In what she recognized as the hallway of a law office, the particular kind of anonymous corridor with gray carpet and framed credentials on the walls. He was talking to a woman, mid-40s, dark hair pulled back, the posture of a professional in her own environment. Vivian knew the woman. She had spoken to her on the phone twice in the last 3 days. She was the federal attorney Reyes had identified as their bridge to Dana Cho. The woman in the photograph with her father was Linda Garland. "Your father went to Garland 14 months ago," Steele said. His voice was patient, almost gentle, the tone of someone delivering a diagnosis. He presented her with a portion of his documentation and asked for protection in exchange for full cooperation. Garland agreed, and then Garland came to us. Vivian set the photograph down. She didn't trust herself to hold it. "Garland is yours," she said. "Garland has been ours for a very long time. She's been extremely useful precisely because she appears to everyone who deals with her to be exactly the kind of incorruptible public servant you'd want in her position." He looked at her steadily. "The remaining documentation your father handed her, the 40% that completes the picture, has been in our possession since last April. We've been waiting to see whether the 60% he retained would surface." "And now it has," Vivian said. "And now it has." She understood then the full architecture of it. Not in pieces, not in the fragmentary way she'd been assembling it since the kitchen table on Saturday night, but all of it at once. The entire structure visible from where she was standing, the way a building looks different from a distance than from inside. Her father had found a crack and tried to use it. and the crack had been manufactured specifically to catch people who were looking for cracks. Garland wasn't a bridge. Garland was a trap. And Reyes was on his way to the water entrance right now with a phone number for Linda Garland in his hand. Her body moved before her mind fully authorized it. She had the phone out of her pocket, not hers, Adrian's, which she'd taken from him in the car on the pretext of texting Reyes the approach coordinates. And she was typing as Steele's expression shifted from patient to alert, the specific shift of a man who has just realized the variable he didn't account for is already in motion. She hit send. One word to Reyes's number, abort. The man by the railing moved. Adrian moved faster. She felt, rather than saw it, the sudden compression of the space, and then the man by the railing was against the railing, and Adrian had his arm in a configuration that was not comfortable for anyone involved, and the man by the partition door made a calculation and stayed where he was, because whatever else was true, Adrian DeLuca in a confined space was a specific kind of problem that required more backup than one person. Steele had not moved. His hand was still on the folding table. His face had reorganized itself into something harder than the patient composure of a minute ago, and Vivian looked at him across that 4 feet of space and felt something in her own face that was equally hard, equally stripped of everything that wasn't pure operational necessity. The drive, she said, contains 63 files. 57 of them have already been transmitted to a secure remote server that neither you nor Garland nor Forsyth has the access credentials for. This was not true, but it was stated with the flat certainty of something that was, and she watched his eyes for the tell. The remaining 6 are duplicates. The drive itself is now redundant. A silence. You're bluffing, Steele said. Am I? You've been in a basement for 3 hours. You haven't had time to... The laptop Reyes used to access the drive was connected to an encrypted remote server before we ever opened the files. She held his gaze. We're not amateurs, Mr. Steele. We're people who have spent the last 8 days finding out exactly what you are, and we planned accordingly. Steele studied her. She could see him running it. The variables, the probability, the cost of acting on the assumption she was lying against the cost of acting on the assumption she wasn't. Then he said, very quietly, "Release the girl." The man by the partition didn't move. "I said release her," Steele repeated, and there was something in his voice now that told Vivian this was not magnanimity. This was a man who was reorienting, who had decided that the asset in the chair was less valuable than the repositioning he needed to do, and that releasing Chloe was the beginning of a new calculation rather than the end of this one. The zip ties were cut. Chloe stood up and her legs were unsteady, and she crossed the space to Vivian in 3 lurching steps, and Vivian caught her with one arm and held her and said against her hair, very quietly, "Don't look around. Just breathe. I have you." Chloe was shaking, her whole body, a fine continuous tremor, the aftermath of fear that had nowhere to go yet. Vivian held the shaking and kept her eyes on Steele. "We're leaving," Vivian said. "Of course," Steele said. And he stepped aside from the head of the stairwell with a gesture that was almost courtly, that performed graciousness the way a weapon performs stillness, completely, and only until it doesn't. They went down the stairs. Adrian first, then Vivian with her arm around Chloe, then the 3 steps to the south door and outside into the cold harbor air. Reyes's vehicle was pulled up 20 meters from the entrance. He'd gotten the text, aborted the waterside approach, repositioned. Vivian put Chloe in the back seat and got in beside her, and Adrian got in the front, and Reyes pulled out without being told to. For 30 seconds, nobody said anything. Then Chloe said, in a small, compressed voice that was trying very hard to be steady, "Viv, what is happening?" "I'll explain everything," Vivian said. "I promise, not right now." "Who were those—" "Not right now, Chloe. I need you to breathe." Chloe breathed. Vivian kept her arm around her sister and felt the shaking gradually, slowly, begin to subside. In the front seat, Adrian turned halfway and spoke to Reyes. "Garland?" "I got the abort," Reyes said. "I hadn't reached out yet." "She's compromised. Full network contamination. Assume anything that passed through her is known." Reyes absorbed this without visible reaction. Then Dana Cho. Direct approach. No intermediary. We'll need to... There's no time for a direct approach, Vivian said from the back seat. Both men turned. She was looking out the rear window. The terminal was behind them now, its lights diminishing, and she was watching for headlights. Not yet, but she was watching. Steele released Chloe because he's repositioning. He knows we have the digital files. He's going to move to destroy the source material, the documentation Garland has been holding, before we can get to it. Because if the full picture exists but the physical records don't, the digital files can be challenged as fabricated. Adrian was quiet for a moment. Where is Garland holding the physical records? I don't know, but Forsyth does. Another silence. Forsyth, Adrian said slowly, is still in my house. Is he? Reyes, is Forsyth still at the property? Reyes picked up his phone, made a 2-second call, listened, ended it. Confirmed. He's in the ground floor study. He apparently didn't run when the alarm triggered. He told the staff he was staying to manage the legal response to the security incident. He's waiting to see which way this falls, Vivian said. He doesn't know we have the photograph. He doesn't know we know about him. He thinks he's still inside. The car was quiet. Chloe had stopped shaking but was sitting very still in the particular way of someone who had put themselves on pause because the world around them had moved too fast to process in real time. Vivian looked at Adrian in the front seat. I need to talk to Forsyth, she said. No. Adrian, absolutely not. He's not going to give you anything voluntarily, and if he suspects, he won't suspect me, she said. He doesn't know what I know about him. As far as he's concerned, I'm the wife who was frightened by an explosion and came home shaken. She kept her voice level. But I need 10 minutes with him alone before he realizes the night went differently than he was expecting. What are you going to do in 10 minutes with a man who has been running intelligence on my organization for 18 months? I'm going to find out where Garland is keeping the physical records, she said, and I'm going to do it in a way he doesn't realize is happening until it's done. Adrian stared at her. In the passing streetlight, his face moved through something. The edge of argument, the edge of a different kind of worry than the operational kind, something she didn't have a name for yet and didn't have time to examine. 5 minutes, he said. 10. 7. And Reyes is outside the door. Fine. They drove. The city moved past the windows, ordinary and indifferent. Its late-night traffic and its lit storefronts and its people going about the business of a Tuesday night, entirely unaware of the particular geometry of this car and the people inside it and what was balanced on the next hour. Chloe reached over and found Vivian's hand in the dark and held it without saying anything. Vivian held it back. She was thinking about Forsyth, about what a man who believed he was still undiscovered would need in the next 7 minutes, what he'd respond to, what he'd reach toward without meaning to, what crack in a careful lie you could open with the right kind of pressure applied in the right kind of way. She had spent 6 years as a paralegal in rooms with people who were concealing things, and she had learned, slowly through failure and adjustment and the slow accumulation of small observations, that the way you got to what someone was hiding was not to push at the hiding, but to put pressure on something adjacent to it, something they didn't know you knew mattered, and wait for the deflection. She had 7 minutes and one piece of information Forsyth didn't know she had, and she was going to take it apart with the particular precision of someone who had nothing left to lose in this room and knew it. The car turned into the DeLuca property gates, and the house appeared ahead, lit from the exterior, looking exactly as it always did. Controlled, composed, the surface of things maintained even when everything underneath was already coming undone. She released Chloe's hand and opened the car door and walked toward the entrance with the specific kind of steadiness that is not the absence of fear, but its complete and total subordination to what has to happen next. Forsyth was in the ground floor study. She could see his shape through the glass panel beside the door, seated, phone in hand, the posture of a man waiting, and she stood outside that door for exactly 2 seconds, breathing, finding the version of herself that could walk into that room and be exactly who he expected until she wasn't. Then she pushed the door open. Forsyth looked up. His face arranged itself into the appropriate expression, concern, relief, the performance of loyalty, and he said, "Vivian, thank God. Are you all right? What happened tonight? Daniel, she said, and sat across from him and folded her hands on her knee and looked at him with an expression she had been building for the last 7 minutes in the back of a car. I need to ask you something, she said, and I need you to understand that I am asking because I trust you. The performance of concern on his face deepened, accommodating itself to the intimacy she was apparently extending. Of course, he said. Anything. Linda Garland, she said. Adrian mentioned her name tonight in a way I didn't understand, and I don't want to ask him directly because I could tell it was connected to something painful. She kept her voice soft, slightly uncertain, the voice of a woman out of her depth who was reaching toward the nearest available anchor. What's her connection to all of this? I just want to understand what we're dealing with. Forsyth's expression moved through 3 distinct phases in approximately 1 second. The first was confusion. The second was something too controlled to identify in the fraction of time it occupied. The third was the performance of a man who had decided what to do and was doing it. Garland is a public integrity attorney, he said carefully. She's had some peripheral connection to cases that touch on Adrian's business interests. It's not something you need to worry about. Adrian mentioned she was holding some documents, Vivian said, and watched his face. There it was. The microsecond of absolute stillness, not the stillness of someone hearing something unfamiliar, but the stillness of someone hearing their own name in a sentence they weren't supposed to be in. Documents, he said. From an old case. He said something about a storage location. I'm sorry, I know I probably shouldn't be asking you, it's just... She made a small, helpless gesture with her hand. Tonight scared me, and I'm trying to understand the shape of what we're in the middle of. Forsyth looked at her for a long moment. The storage facility on Clement, he said, carefully, slowly, the words coming out like a man lowering himself onto ice he's not certain will hold. Garland uses a private document storage facility on Clement Avenue. 3rd floor, climate-controlled. It's where she keeps... He stopped. He had just understood what he'd done. She could see it happen. The moment of recognition arriving in his face like weather moving across a landscape. A visible front, a visible change in the quality of everything, and then the face going very, very still. You already knew, he said. Not a question. The photograph of you and Steele is on its way to 3 separate parties as of 40 minutes ago, she said, and her voice had lost the softness completely. Your name, your mobile number, and a summary of your function inside Steele's network. Adrian knows. And in approximately 4 minutes, he's going to walk through that door, and what happens after that is something I genuinely cannot predict. Forsyth stood up, his chair scraped back. Sit down, she said. Quiet. Absolute. He sat. Because the specific quality of her stillness in that moment, the compressed, loaded quiet of someone who had moved through fear and out the other side into something colder, communicated something that his 11 years of professional experience apparently recognized as more dangerous than the alternative. Clement Avenue, she said. 3rd floor. What's in those records, Daniel? The full picture. All of it. He looked at the table, at his hands, at the life he had built across 11 years that was in the process, right now, of being disassembled in a study in a house that had never been his. And then, in the voice of a man calculating the cost of 2 different kinds of destruction and choosing the one he could survive, he started to talk. Vivian listened and did not move, and did not look away, and when he finished, she stood and walked to the door and opened it, and Adrian was standing in the hallway exactly where she'd expected him to be. Because 7 minutes had passed, and he looked at her face and understood the answer before she gave it. Clement Avenue, she said. 3rd floor. We have maybe 2 hours before Steele realizes Forsyth gave it up and moves the records or destroys them. She looked at him steadily. And there's something else. Something Forsyth just told me that changes everything we thought we knew about why my father was targeted in the first place. Adrian looked at her. In the hallway light, with the night's full weight visible in the set of his face, he said, Tell me. The fraud scheme, the one that used your organization's money as the frame, the one that was supposed to point federal investigators toward you. It was never about the money, she said. It was about acquiring a specific federal judicial appointment. There's a seat opening on the district court. Vale wanted it. The entire operation was designed to discredit every competing candidate and every potential witness, and to position Vale as the prosecutor who brought down a major organized crime network. She paused. My father was one of 6 people who had enough documentation to prevent that appointment from going through. The other 5 are dead, Adrian said. 4 are dead. One is in a care facility in another state, and apparently Steele's people haven't found her yet. She looked at him. Her name is Martha Ellison. She's 71 years old, and she was a bookkeeper for one of the shell companies, and she kept copies of everything because that was her professional habit. A beat. She's the last living witness with physical documentation, and if we don't get to her before they do, the sound of tires on the front drive reached them through the walls of the house. Not one vehicle, multiple. Reyes appeared at the end of the hallway at a controlled run. 4 vehicles at the gate, he said. Not ours. Vivian looked at Adrian. Adrian looked at Vivian. They're not here for the records, she said, understanding it as she said it, the geometry of the night reshaping itself one final time into something that left no comfortable position to stand in. They're here for us. Steele didn't reposition. He accelerated. Adrian turned to Reyes. Secondary exit, now. Reyes was already moving. Vivian grabbed Adrian's arm, not to stop him, to anchor herself for exactly 1 second while she ran the variables. 4 vehicles. The Clement Avenue storage facility. Martha Ellison somewhere in another state. Forsyth in the study behind her, who had just become both a liability and potentially the only card they had left to play. She turned back to the study door. Forsyth. He was still sitting at the table. His face had the gray, depleted look of a man who had already accepted the shape of what was coming. You want to survive this, she said. Then you come with us right now and you repeat everything you just told me to a federal recorder. Not Garland, not Vale, someone we choose. He looked at her for 2 seconds. Then he stood up. They moved through the house fast. Vivian, Adrian, Reyes, and Forsyth behind them in the specific silence of a man who had made his decision and was now simply executing it. The secondary exit was a service corridor running along the kitchen's north wall, ending at a utility door that opened onto the property's west side, away from the front drive. Outside. Cold air. The sound of the vehicles at the front gate was audible. Engines, doors, the clipped communication of men moving with purpose. Reyes had a car positioned on the west service lane, a detail that told Vivian he had prepared for exactly this contingency without being asked, and she filed that away as the kind of competence that mattered in the hours ahead. They got in. Reyes drove without lights for the first 100 meters, using the property's tree line as cover, and then they were on the street and moving, and the house disappeared behind them. Chloe was in the back seat where Vivian had left her, and she looked at the additional passengers, at Forsyth specifically, with the wide, exhausted eyes of someone who had stopped trying to interpret events and was simply enduring them. Vivian reached over and squeezed her hand once. Chloe squeezed back. Neither of them said anything. Adrian turned from the front seat to look at Forsyth directly for the first time since the study. The look lasted 3 seconds and communicated 11 years of trust being reduced to its actual worth in a single, level gaze. Forsyth held it. He didn't look away. That, Vivian thought, was either courage or the particular stillness of a man who had simply run out of places to hide inside himself. Clement Avenue first, Adrian said to Reyes. Then we find Martha Ellison. And Vale, Vivian said. Adrian looked at her. Vale thinks he's still running this, she said. He doesn't know yet that Forsyth flipped. That window is the only clean advantage we have left, and it closes the moment Steele makes a phone call. She met Adrian's eyes. We use it tonight, or we lose it forever. The car moved through the city. The night outside was ordinary and indifferent and entirely unaware that somewhere inside it, a judicial appointment, 4 murders, and the systematic destruction of 6 innocent people's lives were about to be answered for. If they moved fast enough, if the records were still there, if an old woman in an unknown state was still alive and reachable. Too many conditions. Too narrow a window. Vivian looked straight ahead and breathed, and the city kept moving, and the window kept closing. Clement Avenue at 12:43 in the morning was the specific kind of empty that commercial districts get after midnight. Not abandoned, just suspended. The streetlights doing their work on wet asphalt, and the occasional passing car cutting through without slowing. The storage facility was a converted four-story building that had been a textile warehouse in a previous life, its brick face unchanged except for the security panel beside the front entrance and the discreet signage that said Clement Document Management in letters small enough to suggest the clientele preferred not to be findable. Reyes parked on the parallel street and they sat for 90 seconds, watching. "Camera on the entrance," Adrian said. 1. Fixed position, covering the front door and approximately 8 feet of sidewalk on either side. "Service entrance on the south alley," Reyes said. "There'll be a second camera there. Standard setup for this kind of facility." "How do we know Steele's people aren't already inside?" Vivian said. "We don't," Adrian said. "We move on the assumption they're not, and we move fast enough that it doesn't matter." Vivian looked at Forsyth in the seat beside her. He had spent the drive with his hands flat on his thighs and his eyes forward, the posture of a man performing calm because the alternative was coming apart in a moving vehicle. "Which floor, exactly?" "Third floor, North Corridor, Unit 3-14, Forsyth said. His voice was steady but abraded, like something that had been used hard. "Garland has the primary key. There's a secondary access code, 6 digits, that she gave me for emergency retrieval. I never used it." "Give it to me." He gave her the 6 digits. She repeated them back once and locked them down. "If the records are physically intact," she said, "how long to photograph everything we'd need?" "The core material, maybe 40 minutes. Everything, closer to 2 hours." "We have 20, Adrian said, and looked at Reyes. "South Alley." They moved. Chloe stayed in the car. Vivian had looked at her sister and said, very plainly, "Stay in this car and do not open the door for anyone who isn't me or Reyes." And Chloe had nodded with the concentrated obedience of someone who had accepted, somewhere between the library and the shipping terminal and the back seat of 3 different vehicles, that her understanding of the night's events was incomplete, and that the safest thing she could do was trust the one person she'd trusted her entire life. The South Alley smelled of standing water and old refuse. The service entrance camera was where Reyes had predicted, mounted above the door at a 40-degree angle, covering the door and the first 6 feet of approach. Reyes dealt with it in 11 seconds, using a method Vivian didn't watch closely because she was focused on the door itself, on the secondary keypad beside the handle, on the 6 digits she was holding in the front of her mind. The code worked. The lock disengaged with a soft, definitive click. Inside. Stairwell, concrete. The specific institutional silence of a building that stored things rather than housed people. They went up without speaking, footsteps controlled. Forsyth between Vivian and Reyes with Adrian at the front. Second floor landing. Third floor. The North Corridor was exactly what the name suggested. A long hallway with numbered units on either side. The doors heavy-gauge steel with individual locks. The fluorescent lighting on a motion sensor that flickered to life as they entered and made everything sharp and shadowless and slightly too bright after the dark of the stairwell. Unit 3-14, Forsyth's secondary code on the keypad. The door opened. The unit was approximately the size of a large walk-in closet, shelved on 3 walls. The shelves holding archival boxes in the color-coded system that document management facilities use to indicate category and date. Garland's system was meticulous. Labeled, cross-referenced, the professional organization of someone who took the physical security of information seriously. Vivian found the relevant boxes in 4 minutes. There were 3 of them, each labeled with a case reference number that meant nothing on its face, but corresponded, when cross-checked against the records on the USB drive, to the transaction dates in her father's documentation. She pulled the first box and opened it on the floor. Inside was the 40%. The missing piece, physical bank records, original signatures, a chain of custody that hadn't been digitized and therefore couldn't be challenged as fabricated. Her father's handwriting in the margins of several pages, the same compressed, careful hand she'd found in the fireplace, annotating figures and dates with the patient thoroughness of a man building something he didn't know if he'd lived to use. Her throat tightened. She breathed through it. "Adrian." She held up a document. A wire transfer record, original, with 3 signatures she now recognized. "This is Vile. This is him directly authorizing a transfer that moves money from one of Steele's shells into the fabricated investment vehicle. This is the crime. Not adjacent to it, the crime itself. Adrian crouched beside her and looked at it and said nothing for 2 seconds. Then, can we copy these here? Reyes, Vivian said. Reyes produced a compact document scanner from inside his jacket, the kind of preparedness that she had stopped being surprised by. And they started moving. Fast, systematic, no wasted motion. Vivian fed pages. Reyes scanned. Adrian stood at the unit door watching the corridor. Forsyth held the boxes and kept them organized in the sequence they'd need later. 11 minutes in, Adrian said quietly, "Someone's in the stairwell." Everyone stopped. The silence of the corridor was total, except for the fluorescent hum and the distant sound of the building's ventilation. Then, footsteps. Not fast. Measured, careful, the footsteps of someone who was moving slowly because they were checking each floor as they went. "How many?" Vivian said, not above a murmur. "One set, but, Adrian paused. "Single advance, which means they have coverage on the exits and they sent one person up to confirm we're here." "Well, we're not finished." "I know." "How much more?" she said to Reyes. "One box, maybe 6 minutes." "Then we take 6 minutes." "Vivian, we take 6 minutes," she said again, and the flatness in her voice closed the argument because they both understood what she wasn't saying, that without the complete physical record, the digital copies alone could be challenged, and challenged evidence in a case with a corrupted prosecutor was evidence that disappeared, and they were not going to get back into this building after tonight. Adrian looked at her for 1 second. Then he turned back to the corridor. The footsteps reached the third-floor landing, stopped. Vivian kept feeding pages to Reyes. Her hands were steady. Her heartbeat was not. It was doing something loud and somewhat violent in her chest. The body's honest response to what her mind was refusing to acknowledge right now. She could feel it in her throat, in her wrists, in the slight increased sensitivity of her fingertips as she handled each page. Keep moving. 6 minutes. Keep moving. The corridor light tripped off on its motion sensor. They'd been still enough, briefly, that the sensor had lost them. The darkness was sudden and complete except for the thin light of the scanner. In the dark, from the direction of the stairwell door, a voice. "I can see the scanner light. Come out of the unit." Male voice. Unfamiliar. The controlled flatness of a professional. Adrian said from the doorway, equally flat, "Give us 3 minutes." A pause. "That's not how this works." 3 minutes, Adrian said. "Then we walk out, and you take us wherever you're taking us. But we finish what we're doing first." Another pause, longer. Vivian kept moving. Page, scan, and the seconds were enormous, and she could feel each one. 2 minutes, the voice said. She didn't know why he agreed. She didn't spend time on it. She fed pages. Reyes finished the last document with 40 seconds to spare, ejected the scan drive, handed it to Vivian. She put it in her jacket pocket opposite the USB. 2 copies of the complete picture, physical and digital, on her person. She stood up, looked at Forsyth. "Ready?" He nodded. His face was the face of a man who had chosen his direction and was now simply walking it. They came out of the unit into the dark corridor, and Adrian hit the light sensor with his hand as he moved so the fluorescence kicked back on, and the man at the stairwell door was alone, as Adrian had assessed. Mid-40s, the compact build of someone who worked at it, a gun at his hip that he hadn't drawn, which was itself information. "Hands," the man said. "We're walking out of this building," Vivian said. She stepped forward past Adrian, which made the man's eyes move to her and recalibrate, because she was the variable he hadn't modeled. "We have documentation that implicates Marcus Vale in 4 homicides and a federal corruption scheme. In approximately 40 minutes, copies of that documentation are going to reach Dana Cho's personal secure line through a channel that has nothing to do with anyone in this building. You can detain us for 40 minutes, or you can let us walk, and either way the outcome is the same. The only thing that changes is what you're charged with afterward." The man looked at her, looked at Adrian, looked at the unit door behind them, which was still open, the empty shelves visible. His jaw moved, something shifting behind his eyes. The specific recalculation of a man who had been sent to do a job and was now running the numbers on whether the job was still worth doing. "Move," he said finally, and stepped aside. They went down the stairs, through the service entrance, into the south alley, the cold air hitting them like a release valve opening, and Vivian's lungs pulled in 3 deep breaths that she hadn't let herself take for the last 7 minutes. Reyes's car, Chloe's face through the glass, white and watchful and still. They got in. "Did you get it?" Chloe said. "Yes," Vivian said. "Then what now?" "Now we make a phone call." The phone call was not to Dana Cho directly. That channel, they had all agreed, needed to be established through someone Cho would recognize as credible, someone outside every network that Steele or Vale or Garland had touched. Forsyth, in his 2 minutes of greatest utility to anyone in this car, had provided one name, a retired federal judge named Harriet Bowman, who had presided over 3 major public corruption cases, had no connection to the current grand jury investigation, and whose personal contact information Forsyth had because she had been, 18 months ago, a potential obstacle to Vale's appointment that Steele had considered and ultimately decided not to move against because the cost was too high. "Why didn't they target her?" Vivian had asked in the car outside Clement Avenue. "Because Bowman has been documenting everything that's come near her for 30 years, Forsyth had said. She told Vial directly at a bar association dinner that she kept a standing file updated monthly and that if anything happened to her, it went public automatically. A pause. Some people, even in that world, you don't touch. Reyes placed the call from a clean phone at 1:17 in the morning. Harriet Bowman answered on the 3rd ring, which told Vivian something about how the woman slept, or didn't. Reyes talked for 90 seconds, gave the judge's name, the case reference numbers, the nature of the material. Said the words Marcus Vale and grand jury, corruption, and 4 homicides in a sequence that was designed to convey the shape of it without requiring Bowman to take it on faith. A silence on the other end. Then Bowman's voice, dry, unhurried, the voice of a woman who had been in rooms where serious things were decided and had not been impressed by any of them. "Give me an address. I'll have Dana Cho on a secure line in 20 minutes. Reyes gave her the address of a diner 4 blocks from their current position that was open all night, because diners open all night were the kind of place where nothing looked out of place and everything was visible from a booth in the back. They drove, parked, went inside. The diner smelled of coffee and old grease and something frying, and the counterman didn't look at them twice, and Vivian slid into the back booth with Chloe beside her and the 2 drives in her jacket pocket and the physical weight of the last 5 hours sitting in every muscle she owned. Chloe put her head on Vivian's shoulder. Vivian put her arm around her and looked at the table. Adrian sat across from them. He looked like the night had used him. A small cut above his left eyebrow she hadn't noticed until now. The collar of his shirt damp with exertion. The controlled exhaustion of someone running on the last of what they had. He looked at her across the diner table and something passed between them that neither of them named, because there wasn't language available for it yet. And the night wasn't finished, and there was still the matter of 1 phone call and 1 federal prosecutor and the next 20 minutes determining whether 4 years of systematic destruction could be answered for before the people responsible finished repositioning. Reyes's phone vibrated. He looked at it. "Bowman." He handed it to Adrian. Adrian looked at Vivian. She nodded. He answered. "Put it on speaker, low volume, the sound contained to the booth." And Harriet Bowman's dry, steady voice came through the line and said, "I have Dana Cho. She's been aware of irregularities in the Vale advisory relationship for 6 weeks, but has been unable to establish sourcing. You're about to give her sourcing." A pause. "Start from the beginning, and don't leave anything out." Adrian looked at the drives on the table in front of Vivian. Then he looked at Vivian herself, not for permission exactly, but with the specific quality of attention that asked, without words, "Are you sure you want to do this from here? Are you sure there's no going back?" She reached across the table and picked up the phone. "My name is Vivian Carter," she said. "My father was Elliot Carter. He was murdered on March 23rd to prevent him from delivering evidence in a federal corruption case, and I have the documentation that proves it, and I need you to tell me exactly where to send it." A silence on the other end. Then Dana Cho's voice, younger than Bowman's, tighter, the voice of someone who had been waiting for exactly this and hadn't expected to receive it at 1:23 in the morning in what sounded like a diner. "Miss Carter, how quickly can you transmit?" "Immediately," Vivian said. "Then let's go." Reyes was already setting up the transmission on a second device, and outside the diner windows, the city continued its ordinary indifference, and somewhere across town, Rowan Steele was either in motion or about to be, and Marcus Vale was either asleep or would be very shortly, and Linda Garland was wherever she was, and none of them yet knew that the window they had spent 4 years constructing and maintaining and defending had been open for the last 6 minutes to a woman in a diner booth with 2 drives in her jacket pocket and her 20-year-old sister asleep on her shoulder. The transmission began. Vivian watched the progress bar move across the screen and breathed in the smell of old coffee and the specific exhausted warmth of a diner at 1 in the morning, and felt, underneath the tension and the tiredness and everything that still had to be navigated in the hours ahead, the first fragile thread of something she hadn't had since March 23rd. The progress bar hit 40%, 60, 80. Adrian's phone rang, not Reyes's clean phone, Adrian's personal phone, which had a number known to a limited and specific set of people. He looked at the screen. Something moved across his face, a tightening, a controlled sharpening. The specific expression of a man receiving information he had been half expecting and half dreading in equal measure. He answered, listened for 8 seconds, said nothing, ended the call. "What?" Vivian said. He set the phone on the table, looked at it for a moment, then looked at her. "Martha Ellison," he said. "The bookkeeper. The last living witness." "What about her?" "Steele's people found her," he said. 40 minutes ago. She's in a hospital in Delray, but they found her in time. She's alive, but she's—" He stopped, chose the next words carefully. "She's not going to be able to testify, not physically, not in the timeline we need." The progress bar hit 93%. Vivian looked at it. "Does she have documentation on her person?" she said, "or at wherever she's staying?" "We don't know." "Then we need to know, tonight." She looked at Adrian. "Because if Cho has our transmission and Bowman's support and Forsyth's cooperation, but no living witness with independent physical corroboration, Vale's lawyers will challenge the chain of custody on every document, and they will find a way to make it take long enough for him to complete the appointment process." She kept her voice low and flat and absolutely steady. "The appointment hearing is in 9 days. 9 days, Adrian. We have everything we need to stop it, except the one thing they couldn't take from us, because they hadn't found it yet. And now they found it. And if Martha Ellison had documentation and they got to it before we did, then we are 9 days away from watching the man who ordered my father's death sit on a federal bench for the next 30 years. The progress bar hit 100%. Dana Cho's voice came back on the phone, quiet and urgent. "I have the transmission. I'm looking at the Vale wire transfer record right now. Miss Carter, this is enough to open an emergency filing, but I need to know about the Ellison documentation. My office has been aware of her existence for—" "Where's your office's file on her?" Vivian said. A pause. "Classified. Dana." Vivian used her first name deliberately, the way you use someone's name when you're asking them to step over a line with you, and you want them to know you understand the cost. "Is there documentation at Ellison's location, or isn't there?" Another pause. Longer. "Her care facility," Cho said finally. "She checked in under a different name, but she had a private storage unit registered to her legal name in the same county. We identified it 6 weeks ago, and we've been watching it because we believed Steele's network would eventually find her, and we wanted to know if they moved on the unit." "Did they?" "Not yet. As of 2 hours ago, the unit was untouched. But if they have her, then they'll go for the unit next," Vivian said. "How long?" "An hour, maybe less, if they move immediately." Vivian looked at Adrian across the diner table, the cut above his eyebrow, the exhaustion in the set of his jaw, the specific quality of his attention, which had not wavered from her face since she'd picked up the phone, which was, she understood now, in this moment, with the clarity that came from having nothing left to spend on anything except the truth. Not the attention of a man managing an asset or protecting an investment. It was the attention of a man who was in this, completely. Whatever this had started as, that was not what it was now, and they were both going to have to deal with that later, when later existed. "We need to get to that storage unit before they do," she said to him. He looked at her, at Chloe asleep on her shoulder, at the phone on the table and the empty progress bar, and everything that the last 5 hours had been. "It's a 4-hour drive," he said. "Then we leave now." "Vivian, you haven't slept. You've been—" "I'll sleep when Vale is indicted," she said. "Are you coming?" He held her gaze for 3 seconds. Then he picked up his phone, stood, and held out his hand for the check that the counterman was already bringing over, because in diners at 1 in the morning, the counterman always knew when people were about to leave in a hurry. Reyes was already standing. Forsyth hadn't moved, and Vivian looked at him one last time, this man who had given away 11 years of loyalty for reasons she would probably never fully understand, and said, "You're going with Cho's people. Reyes will make the handoff." A pause. "If you cooperate fully, what happens to you afterward is not my concern. But if you run—" "I won't run," Forsyth said, and he sounded, for the first time all night, like a man telling the simple truth about something. Vivian gently moved Chloe's head from her shoulder. Her sister stirred, blinked. "We have to move," Vivian said softly. Chloe looked at her, looked at the diner, at Adrian standing, at Reyes near the door. She was 20 years old, and she had been through something tonight that she hadn't been prepared for, that she hadn't deserved, that had happened to her because of decisions made years ago by people she'd never met. And she looked at her older sister with eyes that were tired but not broken, and said, "Okay." That single word, its steadiness, its trust, its absolute uncomplicated willingness, hit Vivian somewhere below the ribs with a force that she absorbed without showing, because she had gotten very good tonight at absorbing things without showing them. "Let's go," Adrian said from the door. They went. Outside, the city was still dark, still moving, still entirely unaware. The car was where Reyes had left it, and the highway entrance was 6 blocks east, and 4 hours north of where they were standing was a storage unit in a county none of them had been to, containing the last piece of a case that had already cost 4 lives and 1 father and approximately everything Vivian Carter had believed to be true about the shape of the world she'd grown up inside. She got in the car. Adrian got in beside her. Not the front seat this time, but the seat next to her, which she noticed without comment, and which Reyes apparently noticed too, because he adjusted the mirror and said nothing and started the engine. The car moved. The city fell behind them. The highway opened up ahead, dark and straight and empty in the way that highways are at 2 in the morning, the kind of emptiness that feels like the world holding its breath. Vivian leaned her head back against the seat and closed her eyes for what she told herself would be 30 seconds. Just 30 seconds of not processing, not calculating, not holding anything together. Adrian's voice, quiet. "Sleep." "I'm not sleeping." "You closed your eyes." "I'm thinking." A pause. Then, "You can think with your eyes open in 2 hours. Sleep now." She didn't answer, but she didn't open her eyes either. The road moved under them, steady and dark, and Chloe was in the back seat making the small, even sounds of someone genuinely unconscious. And the heater was running, and Reyes drove the way he did everything, without waste, without announcement, just clean, competent forward motion. Vivian thought about her father. Not the bank statements, not the documents, not the March 23rd date on a death certificate. She thought about him teaching her when she was 11 how to walk through a house without making noise. He had framed it as a game. She understood now it was not a game. She thought about the way he'd written her initial on that envelope. Not her full name, just V, the single letter that meant "you are the one I trust with this." And the weight of that trust and the grief of it and the terrible pride of it sat in her chest simultaneously, a bruise that was also somehow a gift. She was going to cry about this. Eventually. Probably for a very long time. Not yet. Her eyes opened. The highway was still dark and straight ahead, and Adrian was watching it through the windshield beside her, and without looking at her, he said, "We're going to get there first." "You don't know that." "No," he said, "but I know you, and I know how you move, and I think that counts for something." 8 days. She had known this man for 8 days. She had signed a contract that was supposed to be a transaction and had walked through the subsequent hours and found, somewhere between the kitchen table and the basement and the diner and everything in between, that transactions had a way of becoming something else when the people inside them were paying attention. She didn't say any of this. She said, 4 hours. "Less," Reyes said from the front. "I know a route." The car accelerated slightly and the city was fully gone now, and the dark highway stretched ahead of them toward a storage unit in a county 4 hours north. And inside that unit was the last piece of the answer to a question that had started with a debt and a marriage contract and a man who had died trying to protect something worth protecting. Vivian Carter looked at the road ahead and breathed, and the car kept moving, and the night began, very slowly, its long turn toward morning. They reached the storage facility at 5:47 in the morning, 11 minutes before sunrise, in the specific gray light that belongs exclusively to the hour before dawn. Not dark, not light. The world suspended between its two versions of itself. The facility was a single-story row of orange doors on a county road that had more fields than buildings, the kind of place that existed outside city jurisdiction, and advertised itself on a hand-painted sign that had weathered several winters. A single security light on a pole, a keypad at the entrance gate. No attendant at this hour. Reyes pulled up short of the gate and killed the engine. No other vehicles. No tire tracks in the gravel that weren't their own. Vivian looked at the facility's entrance for 30 seconds, reading the stillness of it, and the stillness was genuine, the specific quality of a place that hadn't been disturbed yet. "We're first," she said. "For now," Adrian said. They moved. The gate code was in Cho's file, relayed through Bowman's secure line 40 minutes into the drive. One of the small, precise pieces of institutional access that legitimate federal authority could provide when it was moving in the right direction. The gate opened. The gravel was loud under their feet in the morning quiet. Unit 47. The lock was a standard padlock on a hasp, and Reyes had it open in 20 seconds with a tool Vivian had stopped asking about hours ago. The door rolled up. Inside was the compressed life archive of a woman who had known for years that she might need to disappear. Filing boxes? Yes. 4 of them, labeled in the careful hand of a professional bookkeeper, organized by year and transaction type. But also a suitcase, a small fireproof safe, and on top of the nearest box, sealed in a plastic sleeve, a handwritten letter addressed to Federal Investigator, Public Integrity Division. Martha Ellison had been ready. Had been ready, probably, for longer than any of them had known to look for her. Vivian picked up the letter and held it without opening it, because it wasn't hers to open. It was addressed to the people who needed it most, and her job was to make sure it reached them intact. She set it carefully in the document bag Reyes had produced. Then she started on the boxes. They worked for 22 minutes. Fast, methodical, the 4 boxes photographed and scanned in their entirety. The safe, combination written on a strip of tape on the safe's own back panel, the practical logic of a woman who trusted her own system, containing 3 original signature documents that made Vivian's hand stop moving for a full 3 seconds when she unfolded them. One was a payment authorization. Marcus Vale's signature, dated 14 months ago, authorizing a transfer of funds from a shell account directly into an account registered to a company Vivian now recognized as one of Steele's operational entities. Not adjacent, not circumstantial. A direct line in Vale's own hand, connecting him to the financial architecture of a criminal enterprise, while he was simultaneously advising a federal investigation into that same enterprise. The second document was a communication between Vale and Garland, establishing the parameters of their arrangement. Detailed, specific, the kind of document that only existed because both parties had been arrogant enough to believe it would never surface. The third document was a list of names. 6 names, with dates beside each one. Her father's name was third on the list. The dates beside each name were not birth dates. She understood that, without needing it, explained. She photographed all 3, put the originals in the document bag, kept moving. At 6:19, Reyes said, "Vehicle on the county road, moving slow." They finished, rolled the door down, moved back to their car with the document bag, and Reyes had them out of the facility gate and onto the county road heading west before the approaching vehicle had made the turn onto the facility access lane. Vivian watched through the rear window as the headlights of a dark SUV pulled up to the gate they'd just left. 40 seconds. That was the margin. She turned back around and faced forward and said nothing, because there was nothing to say about 40 seconds that the 40 seconds hadn't already said for itself. Reyes drove. Adrian called Bowman. Bowman had Dana Cho on the line inside 90 seconds, and Vivian gave Cho the inventory of what they had retrieved in precise, sequential order, and Cho's voice on the other end was doing the controlled thing that professionals do when they are receiving information that is better than they allowed themselves to expect. The Vail Payment Authorization, Cho said. Original document, his signature. Original, dated, witnessed by a notary stamp that can be verified. A silence that lasted 4 seconds, which in federal prosecutor time was an eternity. Miss Carter, Cho said, I'm filing for an emergency sealed indictment at 7 a.m. when the clerk's office opens. I need you and everyone in that vehicle at my field office no later than 8 o'clock. A pause. Don't stop anywhere. Don't contact anyone outside of this line. Can you do that? Yes, Vivian said. I'll see you at 8. The line closed. The car was quiet. Outside, the sun was beginning its first serious effort over the flat horizon of the county fields, turning the sky from gray to the specific pale gold of very early morning, and Vivian looked at it through the passenger window and thought about her father, and the fireplace grate, and the envelope with her initial on it, and the 6 names on a list with dates beside them, and she let herself feel the full weight of all of it for the duration of 3 long breaths. Then she put it back where it needed to go, in the place inside her where things were held rather than carried, and looked at the road ahead. Chloe was awake. She had been awake, Vivian suspected, for the last hour, sitting in the back seat in her torn green jacket, watching, listening, assembling what she could from the pieces available to her. She was 20 years old and she was not a child, and she had understood more of the night than she'd been given credit for. She leaned forward and put her hand on Vivian's shoulder. Just that. No words. The hand of a sister saying, I am here and I see you in the language that doesn't require sentences. Vivian put her own hand over it and held it there and kept her eyes on the road. They reached Cho's field office at 7:53. It was a federal building, anonymous in brick, and there were 2 agents waiting at the entrance who verified their identities and brought them inside with the quiet efficiency of people who had been briefed and were operating on a timeline. The next 4 hours were the most procedurally intense of Vivian's life, and she had spent 6 years as a paralegal, which meant her threshold for procedural intensity was higher than most people's. She sat across from Dana Cho, who was younger than her voice had suggested, mid-30s, with the kind of focused energy that came from someone who had been waiting 6 weeks for exactly this and was now moving with everything she had, and gave a complete recorded statement that covered everything from the delivery of her father's debt letter through the contents of Martha Ellison's storage unit in sequential order without omission. Adrian gave a separate statement in an adjacent room. She was aware of that, the knowledge of his presence through the wall, the parallel process of 2 people accounting for the same events from their respective angles, and there was something steadying about it that she didn't examine too closely. Forsyth's statement had been taken overnight. He had cooperated completely, which Cho's team confirmed without elaboration, and whatever arrangement had been reached in that process was between Forsyth and the Office of Public Integrity, and Vivian chose not to spend energy on it. At 9:41, Dana Cho came back into the room where Vivian was sitting with a cup of coffee that had gone cold and a legal pad covered in her own notes, and she sat down and folded her hands on the table. The sealed indictment was filed at 7:08, Cho said. Marcus Vail was taken into federal custody at 8:55 this morning at his home. Rowan Steele is currently the subject of an active federal warrant. His people are moving him, but we have coverage on his known exit routes. A pause. Linda Garland surrendered voluntarily at 8:15. She had apparently been anticipating this outcome for some time and had her own counsel present. Vivian looked at the cold coffee cup. My father. The evidence supports a finding of homicide. I won't make promises about how the formal classification proceeds. That's a separate process. But I want you to know that from where I'm sitting, the record is clear. Cho's voice was not soft exactly, but it had the specificity of someone choosing to give a real answer rather than a managed one. Elliot Carter was targeted and killed to prevent him from delivering evidence. That is what happened, and the documentation you recovered makes it prosecutable. Vivian nodded once. It was a small nod. It didn't match the size of what it was acknowledging, but it was what she had available. Martha Ellison, she said, is in stable condition. The incident last night was they used a pharmaceutical agent designed to appear as a natural cardiac event. Cho's jaw tightened briefly. She is going to recover, and she is, per the attending physician, extremely angry, which her doctors appear to find encouraging. Something moved through Vivian's chest that was almost, not quite, but almost, a laugh. She pressed her lips together and breathed through it. "Is there anything else you need from me today?" she said. "Not today." Cho stood. "You'll be needed for the formal proceedings, but that's weeks away, and my office will be in contact through proper channels." She paused at the door. "Miss Carter, what you did, the manner in which you assembled and preserved this evidence under the conditions you were operating under, I want you to understand that without it, this case does not exist. The indictment does not exist. Whatever happens to Vale and Steele in the months ahead begins with what you did last night." Vivian looked at her. "My father did it first," she said. "I just carried it the last mile." Cho looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded and left. And Vivian sat alone in the federal interview room with her cold coffee and her legal pad and the specific hollow exhaustion that comes not from having lost, but from having spent everything you had on winning and not yet having the space to understand that it's over. She sat there for a few minutes. Then she got up and walked out. Adrian was in the corridor, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, the cut above his eyebrow cleaned and closed with a butterfly strip that someone on Cho's staff had apparently provided. He looked at her when she came through the door, and the look was the same one that had been there across the diner table, both present, specific, the attention of someone who was not managing a situation, but simply in it. "Vale's in custody," she said. "I know." "Steele's in the wind, but they have coverage." "I know that too." She stopped a few feet from him. The corridor was empty in both directions, the kind of institutional quiet that exists in federal buildings during the working day when nobody is in the hallway. The fluorescent lights were the same everywhere in buildings like this, honest and unflattering and completely indifferent to what happened beneath them. "The contract," she said. He looked at her. "We're at, 9 days of 12 months. She kept her voice even. "The terms have been significantly complicated by events." "Yes," he said. "The original purpose has been served. The debt is cleared. The estate is protected. The evidence is delivered." She looked at the middle distance between them. "Technically, there's no operational reason for the arrangement to continue." He was quiet for a moment. "Is that what you want? To discuss the operational reasons?" She looked at him directly. "I want to discuss the actual reasons." He pushed off the wall and stood straight, and in the corridor light he looked like what the last 9 days had made him. Not the symbol that had walked into her foyer with 3 cars and a contract. Not the controlled surface of the man across the kitchen table. Just a person who had been through something alongside her and come out the other side changed in ways that hadn't finished revealing themselves yet. "The divorce papers," he said. "When the year ends, I'll have them prepared. You can decide then." "That's 11 months away." "Yes." "A lot can change in 11 months." "A great deal has changed in 9 days," he said. "I've learned to account for that." It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't the kind of language that belonged in the movies she'd watched growing up, where people said enormous things in corridors and the music told you how to feel about it. It was just a man telling a woman, plainly, that he was paying attention and intended to keep paying attention, and that whatever came next, he was not going to pretend the 9 days hadn't happened. She looked at him for a moment, then she turned toward the lobby. Chloe needs breakfast, she said. There's a place 2 blocks from here that opens at 7. It's almost 11. They serve breakfast all day. He fell into step beside her. I've been there before. Of course you have, she said, and something in her voice that hadn't been there in 9 days, something lighter, something that belonged to the person she'd been before all of this and was apparently still in there waiting, came through the exhaustion and landed in the space between them without ceremony or announcement. They walked out of the federal building into the morning. The sun was fully up now, the pale gold of early morning having shifted into something warmer and more committed, the kind of October light that made even a federal parking lot look briefly forgiving. Chloe was sitting on a bench outside with Reyes standing nearby, and when she saw Vivian, she stood up and covered the distance between them in 4 steps, and put both arms around her sister with the particular force of a person who has been holding a very large thing and is finally allowed to put it down. Vivian held her, felt the shaking. Not the fear shaking of the shipping terminal, but the other kind, the release kind, the kind that meant it was over and the body was finally getting the news. I want you to tell me everything, Chloe said into her shoulder. All of it, from the beginning. I know. Dad. I know. Vivian held her tighter. I will, I promise. They stood there for a while. Adrian and Reyes were a respectful distance away, 2 men who understood the geometry of a moment that didn't include them and were accommodating it without comment. When Chloe finally stepped back, her eyes were wet and her chin was set with the Carter stubbornness that Vivian recognized because she saw it every morning in the mirror, and she said, Is it finished? The worst of it, Vivian said, but not all of it. While the rest is paperwork and court dates and months of depositions. Vivian looked at her. The part where we were afraid is finished. Chloe nodded, wiped her face with the back of her hand, looked at Adrian across the parking lot with the frank, assessing look of a 20-year-old who had been through something and was recalibrating everything she'd been told versus what she'd observed. He stayed, Chloe said quietly. Yes. The whole night. He stayed. Yes, Vivian said. Chloe looked at her. The assessing look shifted into something that might have been the beginning of understanding, and she didn't say anything else about it because she was the kind of person who knew when a thing was still forming and needed space rather than commentary. Breakfast, she said instead. 2 blocks, Vivian said. They serve it all day. They walked. The 4 of them, on a sidewalk in a city none of them lived in the October morning light, moving away from a federal building and toward coffee and food and the ordinary human business of sitting at a table and eating something after a night that had required everything they had. The city around them was doing what cities did, indifferent, ongoing, its own enormous and unrelated life moving past in every direction. Vivian walked and felt the ground under her feet and the cold air on her face and the specific and irreplaceable warmth of her sister's arm pressed against hers as they moved. And she thought about a man who had kept records in an oilcloth envelope behind a fireplace grate and written her initial on the outside. And she thought about what it meant to carry something for someone who couldn't carry it anymore, and whether the carrying changed you and whether the change was the kind you could live with and grow from or the kind that just cost you. She thought about it for 2 blocks. And then the breakfast place appeared. Small, warm-looking, the kind of window steam that meant the kitchen had been going for hours. And Chloe said, "This looks good," and pulled the door open, and the smell of coffee and something frying came out into the cold morning air, and Vivian walked inside. She sat in a booth by the window. The sun came through the glass and lay across the table in a band of light that was warm on her hands, and she looked at it for a moment. Just that, just the light on her hands, the simple and entirely unearned comfort of morning sun in a warm room after a long and irreversible night. Adrian sat across from her. He picked up the menu. She picked up hers. Across the table, Chloe was already talking to Reyes about something that had made him produce an expression she hadn't seen on him before, which appeared to be the early stages of a smile. The server came. They ordered. The coffee arrived almost immediately, and Vivian wrapped both hands around the cup and let the heat move into her palms and sat for a moment in the uncomplicated fact of being alive and intact in a warm room with people she trusted, and that, the simple and enormous fact of that, was enough to hold on to for now. The rest would come. The depositions and the court dates and the formal proceeding of justice working its slow, imperfect way toward something that resembled accountability. The grief that still had its full volume left to express, waiting patiently for the space she'd make for it when the machinery stopped requiring everything she had. The estate, which would need tending, and her sister, who needed the full truth gently and completely told, and the question of 11 remaining months and what they might mean and what they might become. All of it was coming. She knew that. She was not the kind of person who confused a pause for an ending, but right now the coffee was hot, the light was real. And somewhere in the federal building 2 blocks behind her, a sealed indictment with Marcus Vale's name on it existed in the world because her father had kept faith with the truth even when the truth was trying to kill him, and she had carried it the last mile, and the mile was done. She drank her coffee. Outside the window, October moved through the city in the ordinary and unstoppable way that time moves through everything, without permission, without ceremony, without any particular concern for what it was leaving behind or what it was moving toward. Vivian Carter sat in the morning light and breathed and let it.